Good evening. My name is Cheryl Jefferson Bell. I am currently serving as pastor of community justice, and we welcome you to this third part of this second series called Becoming Beloved Community, Going Deeper. And we are so excited that you are here with us, and it has been an interesting and growing experience and going deeper into becoming the beloved community. Tonight, we are going to have some amazing panelists that are with us. If you recall our first session, we talked about our statement that dealt with a vision for racial justice, and we talked about Black Lives Matter. Then the second week, we spoke about and talked about systemic racism and looked at mass incarceration, and we also unpacked whiteness. And so tonight we are talking about and exploring becoming anti-racist, and you will get great wisdom from our panelists. And so as we begin, I'm going to open with prayer, and then I will invite Stuart to begin, and he has been my partner in crime for this series. I'm so appreciative of him and his gifts and talents, so you will be hearing from him soon, so let us pray. Oh, Lord our God, we thank you and give you thanks and praise for your Spirit, for your Son, for the love that you pour into our lives. You have called us to be like Jesus, to love, and to uplift your people so that this community and beyond will be more like the kingdom of God. Help us, O Lord, to do your will. And we ask this all in the mighty name of Christ, our living Savior. And everyone out there said, amen. All right, Stuart.
Yes, so I'd like to introduce our guests tonight. I'm excited because these are some of my friends and my favorite people. I'd like to introduce Anita Maltbia. Anita is the lay leader for Allies for Racial Justice from St. James, and she has been involved in so much in Kansas City for so long that I'm going to let her talk about that during her time because I could not do justice to all of the things that Anita has been involved in. But I'm so glad that we're friends and work together on Allies for Racial Justice. I'd also like to introduce my friend, Dr. Wes Parham. I started to say singer-songwriter, and I meant to say speaker and author, and the executive director of the Urban Scholastic Center is with us. And also with us is Betsy Triplett, who was the original lay leader for Allies for Racial Justice when it started in 2016, and been working together for years on that with Betsy. And so we look forward to everything that everyone has to share tonight. And I'm Stuart Curtright. I am in the local mission department here at Church of the Resurrection on the Leawood campus, and Allies for Racial Justice is one of the ministries that I relate to. So tonight, I'm the opener, and so what I thought it would be kind of fun to do is to, the power of story is so important, and our personal stories and personal experiences are so important that I wanted to give everybody a little bit of just a quick glimpse of who I am so you get a grasp of who it is. And I believe that right now you may be seeing my great aunt. She was making hand sanitizer, is what that photo is right there. Then the next photo, that's I think these are going in a different order than I'm seeing you all. That's my grandparents on a farm in Climax Springs. And then the next photo is my grandparents on my mother's side near Hollister, Missouri, which is just south of Branson. Then this next picture is the day that my sister was getting introduced to what she thought was her new doll. It's my sister Stephanie. There's my first fishing trip with my dad. I caught all of those myself. I just want to put that out there. And that's me. That was pretty much normal attire. There's my first sports car. That red sports car will come important later. This is a picture of my family. I had to put that up there because I don't know why my dad had those pants, but I want you all to know that's 1974 probably, so that's the excuse for those pants. That's my Uncle Corky. He actually had a farm here in Lewisburg, Kansas, and he was a wrestler before wrestling became famous. That's my full family. I believe that's 1975. And that's obviously my 12th birthday, and got braces. and got rid of the braces and got glasses. That's middle school. And something my dad and I did a lot was deer hunting. Apologize for the gory photo, but that's a little bit of who I am. That's where I lived when I was in high school. Me and my dad and my motorcycle. Another deer hunting picture. I didn't put tons of them in there. And there is actually the first red sports car that I ever owned, my Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. And that's a picture of my mom. And just for you KU fans, in case you don't recognize that, that is the University of Missouri-Columbia, and that's 1989. That's my backyard in middle school and grade school. Our backyard ended at that fence. That's me at 5, and I actually wore that to kindergarten. That was the kindergarten year picture. That was what I wore to kindergarten. And that is me in junior high, and that is Jana Jay, who was a famous fiddle player and played on a lot of country music stages. And I was actually, she let me play fiddle with her at a concert. Little fun fact there. Okay.
I didn't know you played fiddle.
Most people don't, so that's the fun fact now. The Stuart actually did play the fiddle. Part of what I want to show you that is I think our personal stories and our personal experiences are so important, and it gives a little bit of flavor for who we are. And our own stories we carry with us, and you can probably see through that in those different that montage of photos that I picked up pieces from my parents, who picked them up from their parents and picked them up from their parents. And then we carry our family stories forward. And I think that those are so important in how they shape us. It's not just my personal experience now, but I carry forward with me the personal experiences of my parents and then of their parents and of their parents. And we carry those forward. And so that's who shaped me. And yes, I make some choices myself, but I'm also always carrying forward the story of my family, and it's embedded within me, and I am my story and is a part of who I am. It's kind of like how we live in a culture, but the culture also lives within us. And for me, that was kind of reflective. When I look at it in the picture of my life, I'm going, oh yeah, it's fairly obvious, at least wise to me, who that is. Now, some folks, some of those photos may have resonated with you, and you may have said, oh, I remember that, or you had that experience. And some people probably had no reference for any of those photos. We can have different experiences, and we all have different experiences. And we grew up in different geographic locations. Depends on what era you were. A lot of that as Gen X, you probably recognize those photos from the 70s and some in the 80s. They may have made sense to you. But part of what sent me down the path of literally walking back through those was about 4 weeks ago, one of my childhood friends told his story. And when I was listening to his story, he literally was telling the story of our childhood. And when I mean telling the story of our childhood, I mean literally, because we grew up together in the same town in Holt Summit, Missouri, which is just north of Jeff City. We grew up together and then went to the same grade school, the same junior high, and the same high school, and we both went to college together at the same time. And interestingly, we actually have the same birthday. So when I say he told stories of our childhood, I mean he literally told our childhood stories. So it kind of motivated me to go back and look at my childhood stories too, because part of what hit me is Carl was sharing his story, and he was telling it unfiltered. I got emotional, and then I got angry, and then I began to think, that's not possible, because we grew up in the same town. It was only 2,400 folks. I mean, that's not a big town. So we were in the same spaces, the same places, and we were in those same spaces and places through the 70s and the 80s, and yet his experience was vastly different than mine. And one of the few differences between Carl and I, especially having the same birthday, was literally the color of our skin. And hearing his story made me think, how did I experience my childhood so differently than Carl experienced his when we had the same childhood environment and experiences? So it forced me to go back and really rethink some stuff. And as I began to do that, some stories began to roll through my head. And so I would encourage anybody, that's one of the first steps I think that we have to do when we're trying to become anti-racist, is to look at ourselves and our lives first and unpack some stuff. Because we do carry forward our stories and our experiences. And I began to think of jokes that I heard on the playground. I'm not going to tell any of them because first of all, I don't want them coming out of my mouth, and some of them are just too painful. So I'll just refer to them as the black jokes that maybe some of you know or maybe you heard in grade school. Um, and I even thought about how many Pollock jokes that I heard and then also told. I don't think it was high school till I started going, why are we telling these jokes? And I'm not even sure I understand, uh, didn't click with me even as a little kid that we were talking about Polish people in general, and I didn't even know any Polish people, so why was I telling stories about them? So as I began to look back through that, there was a couple stories in my own mind, even from my childhood, that kind of came back up to me, and I want to share one of those stories in particular. As typical grade school kids, especially during the summer when you don't have a lot to do, and this was also before video games and cell phones and everything else, is I would have friends over on Friday night to spend Friday night and then play all day Saturday. And so trade back and forth, right? I would go to Chris Cohn's house one weekend, and Chris would come to mine, and I might go to Scotty's, and then he would come to mine. And so that was kind of how the summer was, as you spent the weekend at one of your friends, or at least Friday night and Saturday with one of your friends. And so it would have probably been a Thursday evening. We were sitting down at the dinner table, and I said, hey, this weekend can I have Jeff over to spend the weekend? And my dinner table got kind of quiet. So I asked again. I was like, hey, can Jeff come over this weekend? And my mom's head was kind of rattling around a little bit, and I thought, well, maybe we're going camping or we're going to do something else, and so that maybe that we're busy. So I said, well, is it okay? Can Jeff come over this weekend? And my mom was like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, well, what are we doing? And you know kids, why? So I just kept asking, why, Mom? Why, what's going on? What are we doing? So I kept peppering my mom with the why questions, and finally my mom said, well, I just don't think it's a good idea. And I was like, well, why? Back to the why question. Mom, why is that not a good idea? And my mom said, well, I don't know what the neighbors will think. Now, this was 1975. And in my mind, I was thinking, what are the neighbors going to think about what? Because Chris was over last weekend. Probably Scotty was over the weekend before that. So what are the neighbors going to think why Jeff is over? So I asked that question. And after a long pause, my mom said, Jeff's black. And for me, that's the first time in my memory that I remember anyone identifying somebody as being different than me or being other. So then I quickly followed it up with, well, I don't know what difference that makes because I didn't fully understand what black and what white meant in 1975 or 1976. And so my mom got a little bit anxious. And then this is where it's interesting, where stories come together, because we had some stuff that my mother's story came to the table, literally, and then my father's story came to the table, and I'm sitting right in the middle of two stories, two inherited stories and two inherited experiences. And my dad said, if my son wants to have his friend over to the house, he can, and I don't care what the neighbors think. And tonight's topic is about anti-racism, and I realized that was a moment where my story that I continued could have went one direction, but because my dad said, I don't care what the neighbors think, my story went a different direction. Jeff also came over and spent the night that night. So also, if I think now, we didn't have the word or use the word anti-racist in the 70s and 80s, 90s, and recent. But for me, I was so appreciative of the fact that my dad made an anti-racist decision that we were going to be this family moving forward. So I share that story with you as just part of my story, part of my personal experience, and some of the stuff that I carry forward with me to this day. Thank you. Betsy, I know you have, Betsy and I are also the same age. Shout out to Gen X tonight, right now. Gen X is in the house tonight. Betsy also, went to KU, graduated from KU.
You don't have to be sorry. It's all good.
Okay. So we have similar and we have different experiences, but I want to just give Betsy an opportunity to talk a little bit tonight about anti-racism, just some of your views and some of your experiences tonight.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you for letting me be on this panel, honestly. I don't want to go on too long because I can't wait to hear what Dr. West has to say, and of course, my friend Anita always edifies me every time I hear her, so I will try not to go on too long. I do want to share my story a little bit. because maybe it will speak to some other people in our congregation. As Stuart said, I'm a 1966 entry into this world, and my whole story, my whole history has been really in a very white world. I went to all the schools that I went to the Shawnee Mission School District until I was about 10. Then I moved to Blue Valley and graduated from Blue Valley High School, where Adam Hamilton also graduated, and very, very white school. There was a handful of black people and some people of color as well, but predominantly white. Then I went on to KU, and while certainly a much more diverse environment, I pledged a sorority that was almost completely white. And that was kind of definitely my social circle. I was an accountant undergrad, and again, a lot of whiteness in that particular profession at that time. Then I went on to law school, similar, a lot of white people. The law firm that I ended up joining, actually, Mayor Sly James was part of, so we certainly had some black people in that law firm, but not very many. And in the office that I was in, there weren't any black people. So that was it was just a constant white experience. That also includes my church that I went to, Stanley Presbyterian Church growing up. Again, very, very white. Started going to CORE in 2001, and it is very white as well. So as I was going through life, it just seemed pretty normal, quite honestly. And as God brought me into this work and into this arena, I just realized how ignorant I actually really am, and how easy it is to be ignorant of so many things like that, growing up the way that I did. So I would say the first couple people that I really met, that I really formed relationships with, that were black, were coaches to my son in basketball when he was kind of a little boy. So he was about 10. And I met a young man named Kyle Speed, and he is just amazing. There's no other way to put it. He had 2 young children at the time, and he was a much better parent to them, with much less experience, of life experience anyway, than I had. But he was just a very special person, shared his faith with my son, and it was really meaningful. And so I started actually wanting to know that person other than just as my son's basketball coach. And then Kellen Jackson was his next coach, and very similar thing. We are still very close friends to this day, and he's just an amazing person. But I still wasn't really I still didn't see it. I still didn't get it at all. I kept wondering, as I was doing Bible studies and other things, Christianity in general was also kind of confusing to me. How does this world that we're living in relate to what I'm learning about Jesus and what he wants us to do and what we are called to do? It didn't seem to match to me. And so at a certain point, I think that is why God called me to this work, to get to understand more about the history of racism in our country, because it all then started to tie together in terms of, there's really 2 things to me, the 2 great commands: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And those are very simple. It doesn't get very confusing in theology. They're very simple to understand. Very difficult to do. I struggle daily. I fail often. But that's then why I believe that I was called into this stuff, to look into the history of racism in this country and how that all equates. Because I didn't even know who my neighbors were. I didn't know what their experiences were. I didn't know anything about that. I was totally ignorant and clueless, quite frankly. So when we came tonight to talk about anti-racism, you know, I just think about how much I have grown. There's so many terms in all this stuff. It can get so complicated, right? There's so many terms and so many people will use them differently even a lot of times. And so for something that's already challenging, you've got that added into it, and people can just kind of throw up their hands pretty easily. And so I guess, like I said, when I look at Christianity and I look at racism, so to be anti-racist to me is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's as simply as I can put it. There's all kinds of other ways to go about that, and hopefully as a church we are really committed to that journey now. I actually was involved with racial reconciliation stuff that was going on here in early 2000s. There's a brilliant report that was written in 2003. There was one that was written in 2007 on social justice. Lots of great research that was done, lots of wonderful writing that was done about this subject, and suggestions for how we could do that. So those are things that we can definitely revisit, because sadly they, in 2020, still are things that we could go forward with. So for me personally, I just can't imagine not doing this stuff now. It's one of those things where, you're totally ignorant of something and then all of a sudden you feel like it's common knowledge. And I'll give you an example of that. When I first started, my great now friend, Dr. Ernest Middleton, he was the lead lay leader for St. James when he first started Allies for Racial Justice. And we sat down and talked, the first time we sat down and talked, and I think we were both a little apprehensive as to how it was going to, go for us and how our relationship would be. And we just started sharing stories. Like Stuart said, it's so important to share your stories and to just be real with each other. And I knew early on that it was going to work well with him, because a couple of different things. One, he talked glowingly of both his mother and his wife. And so a man to me that respects his mother and his wife, it's good stuff. So, but he really stuck with me with a lot of things. We talked about a lot of things over the years. And, I remember sitting outside of the library off the plaza, the Kansas City, Missouri Library, and talking about colorblind. Why is colorblind a bad thing? Why is that not a good thing? Because that's how we were. That was another whole era of, okay, let's just make everything okay and look at everybody the same way. And that just completely ignores, unfortunately, the history of that things aren't okay, and there's a reason things are not okay. And so it's really, now I see the absurdity of it, but not long ago, I needed somebody to explain it to me as to why that's not an okay thing. So this journey is really, it's really important to go on. It's really valuable to go on. And for me personally, it has helped me, I believe, become a better Christian and look at the whole world in terms of how do we value things. We rank everything. Everything is ranked. Everything has a hierarchy. And that is not, I don't think anywhere that Jesus said to do that. I don't know. I haven't ever seen it. I don't think it's what he's about. So it's just one of the many reasons it's really important for our church to do this work, I think.
Thank you, Betsy.
And another question for Betsy. So, doing the work, what would be something that you would think, specifically to this church, because we probably can't fix Christianity in general or address it, and Jesus will take care of that, hopefully. But definitely. But specifically for Resurrection, what do you see something that Resurrection could, as a congregation or as staff, that you would be excited about to see happen?
Well, I think there's so many things, and our church has such great opportunity to make such great progress in this area. We are known as a thinking church. Adam is very much a teaching preacher. He is very historically based in what he talks about. He tries to challenge us a lot, I believe, and so we are ripe to do this work and to really make progress. And this is certainly the time to do that, I think. So intentionally, we will have to make it intentional, though, as a church to discipleship is going to have to include this in curriculum. I know there is some work being done on that already in terms of trying to educate the congregation, but that is a really, really important step. Because while it's all very personal work that you need to do, because our stories are all different, we all come from different backgrounds and different ways that we were raised. It is personal, but it also, and I think Wes was mentioning this earlier, it's a corporate repentance we need to do as well as a church. And so to do it corporately, it's a hard thing to do, but it's very worth it. But to do it together, it will be way more impactful, and people will be able to wrestle with the things that challenge them about it. If you're doing it personally, it's just a lot easier to drop. And frankly, as a white person, you still kind of can drop it. It's going to get to a point where we can't drop it anymore. I'm a mother. My kids are not going to be able to drop it. I don't want them to drop it. So, so that's really important, is to make education and be consistent and persistent about making that happen here. The other thing is the missions area, for instance. We need to really be careful. One thing that happened when I took my son to a summer reading program where we were helping some of our partner school kids in a summer reading program. It was a great program. But it bothered me a great deal because it was me and my white son and several other white people from Resurrection, and we were helping almost completely black children, a few Hispanic children in this particular program, helping them read. And I hated the message that it was sending to both my son and those children. And it sounds crazy because there is a need there, and I want to help fulfill that need, but I don't ever want my kid to think, because he doesn't have very many black people around him in his circles, and then he sees a bunch of black people that need help reading, I mean, I talked through that with him, obviously, but the messages that we can be giving to both the children that we are helping and to us as the helpers, we have to be really careful about that and really understand and make sure we're not reinforcing biases in both ways. So that's a big one for me. What I've always hoped and always wanted is to form partnerships with black people. St. James that's one of the main reasons I love that we have this partnership, is to form partnerships with us so that we can do those mentoring things, those tutoring things together. And so that then is a great example for everyone at that point. They see us working together on these things. So it's not a power thing or a savior kind of thing. So
maybe for both black and white children, or color, people, children of color, I should say. So
right,
yeah.
Right, absolutely. Those are a couple of examples.
Thank you, Betsy. I think those are very good examples. And when I said I want to make sure people don't think I think that the Big C church is broken, I just mean it's made up of us broken Christians. So that means it's got a lot that has work to do. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts, Dr. Wes, on anti-racism. Also, before I introduce it, I want to say how we met. Sure. We met at and Betsy and I and Wes all met together on a 2-day seminar on the Racial Equity and Inclusion Project. So you want to talk about having to get to know each other fast. fast, and we just got deep quick. And I actually enjoyed that because that we found out who each other was, and I found a good friend. For me, again, I've said this before. I don't enjoy surface level conversations a lot, but boy, when you get down there and dig deep, you end up sometimes finding really good friends. And so I want to introduce a really good friend of mine, Dr. Wes, and hear your reflections on becoming anti-racist.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I want to thank everybody for allowing me to be here and speak. And you're right, that was a phenomenal experience. 2 days in, it's like boot camp for racism. It was it was great. And so I'm excited to be able to share, I guess, some of my thoughts and to be here with you all. And to thank you all for doing this. There are so many. In my role, I get the privilege of interacting with quite a few churches and things like that. And there are so many who have not even taken the step to address this, let alone say, hey, we're going to put out a statement and we're going to have some follow-up conversations and we're not going to stop there. And so I appreciate you all doing this and taking that initiative and that leadership, because I really do feel like this is an area where the church should be leading. Now I'm going somewhere where I wasn't planning on going, but my wife grew up in the Nation of Islam. And in the Nation of Islam, the idea of race and faith are intertwined. And so when she came to Christianity and saw kind of my experience with racism being, I don't know if you guys know this, I'm a dark-skinned guy. I don't know if that's, yeah. But she saw that and began to kind of say, hey, where did the faith community speak into this? And when she recognized that I had kind of siloed that part of my life out because the church didn't speak to that troubled her. And so for me, for you all to do this is huge, because I do think this is an area of pain and hurt where we as the body of Christ say, you know what? Jesus gave us the answer for pain and hurt in human existence. But for some reason, we act like we're going to skip over this area of pain and hurt. And I feel like the church has the answer to this problem. You know, one of the things I firmly believe, and I am really going not where I was planning on going. One of the things I firmly believe is I believe that in God's eyes, race and ethnicity is so important that when he comes back, he won't erase it. You know, when he comes back, it says you'll see people from every nation and every tongue. And you start being like, how you know what nation they from? You'll be able to look. I do not believe that he's going to erase race, because I believe that for him, that is so much beauty in what he created. And so I firmly believe that. And I'll have a scripture debate with any of you all who want to debate that afterward. But I firmly believe that. And so I want to thank you guys for that. And dealing with this idea of anti-racism. When I think of anti-racism, I think for me, my reflection comes with this idea of being intentional about it. You know, Betsy used the example of being able to drop it. You know, as a white person, you get the opportunity to drop it. And I think that for me is the difference between intentionality and passivity. When you're intentionally holding something, you can't drop it, right? I used to watch, not as much anymore, but I used to watch football. And when you watch football, there will be 18 dudes who hit a guy, and he'll hold on to that ball because he's intentional about holding on to it. He's not passive. He didn't passively catch the ball. It's not something he's passively holding. He's intentional about holding on to that. And that's how I feel like is the essential point of being anti-racist is we need to be intentional about it. One of my favorite quotes is, when it comes to change, you will not accidentally find that which you do not intentionally pursue. In other words, if we really want to be anti-racist, we won't accidentally find it. It has to be something we're intentional about pursuing. In fact, one of my favorite definitions of anti-racist, when I was looking this up, describes it this way: anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices and attitudes. But it's the active process. It's something that you have to actively do. You have to be intentional about doing it. And that's really what I want to talk about, I guess, with my reflections is this intentionality, but not just being intentional, but talking maybe about how to be intentional. Because I think a lot of times we say, just be intentional about it, and we don't maybe give some steps. And I want to give some steps on how to be intentional. Of course, whenever you start holding conversations about being intentional about anti-racist, there's typically two types of objections or challenges that begin to come up. Immediately, one of the groups are just nonsense, right? These are the people who really have no intention of doing it whatsoever, but they want to start throwing out some reasons. Well, there's no empirical research that supports it, or, how do we know, any of that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter what you show them, they just don't really want to do it. And so the great thing about them is they're usually not on these kind of calls, so they're not here. So I'm not talking to them. I'm not talking to them. But there is another group of people that I think come into play, and these are people who have every intention of being intentional about anti-racism, but they have some misperceptions, right? The misperceptions are that to be intentionally racist, or to be not intentionally racist, hopefully you're not doing that, but to be intentionally anti-racist means that the only kinds of form that you could do are street level protesting, right? And maybe because of child care or work hours or whatever, you can't do street level protesting. And so all of a sudden you decide, well, I can't be intentional about this thing. And so I want to talk about that and kind of clear up, hey, that's not how it is. In fact, my own personal story, even though I started with street level protests and protesting and marching streets and forming an NAACP chapter on UMKC's campus and President African American Student Union, all those kind of things. For the past 14 years, my journey of anti-racism hasn't been street level protest. It's been in other formats. And so I think for me, that's one of the perceptions that need to be addressed. The other one is, of course, the idea that somehow anti-racist work is separate from your daily life. It's something you go do over here, and then you go back to life, and then you go do it back over here. And I think hopefully I can share maybe a couple of stories later that illustrate that doesn't have to be the case either. Anti-racist work doesn't have to be something that's separate from what you normally do. And then there's the third group, which is the group that says, all right, I'm ready, I'm willing, but this topic is so big and I don't know where to start and things like that. And for me, I think that's the group that I can help the most with saying, hey, let's talk about how to be intentional. And I think they'll benefit the most because they're looking for ways to do this. And so hopefully I can speak to them. And so for them, I've identified a 3-step process for being intentional in anti-racist work. So if you're interested to know, for people who are in there, the first thing, the easy, to be clear, there's actually 2 main things. If you're in that last group, you just don't know where to start. The easy thing to do is go find an organization that's already doing that work and just join in, right? I run an organization called the Urban Scholastic Center, and we're doing anti-racist work every day. We see 850 plus students a month. We're doing literacy programs. We're doing entrepreneurship programs. We're trying to change structures and systems that are put in place that maybe have prevented people who are of color from being able to do and be all that they can be. And so we're doing that. And we'd love to have you come volunteer with us. Come down, volunteer with us, spend some time with us. Hey, you want to send us some money? We'll take that too. We're a nonprofit, whatever you want to do. But find somebody who's doing that work. Join Allies for Racial Justice. Join the Urban League. Look into all these different things. So find an organization that's already doing. That's the easy way to do it. But let's say that out of the millions of those organizations out there doing that, you can't find one. Okay. For you, I have a 3-step process. I call it IEP. Now, I work in education, so in education is usually that's your individual education plan, but I call it IEP. 3 steps really that you can do to be intentional, and hopefully I'll share 2 stories of how I use this model. So those 3 letters stand for identification, education, and policy, right? Identification is identifying wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, where the racism exists. Because the truth of the matter is, I normally don't like to give a lot of props to racists, but the racists were thorough in their racism, right? They were like, no swimming, no walking, no eating, whatever you were doing, you could not do it with us. They were thorough in their racism. And so as a result, you can pretty much just look around wherever you are. And if you're not sure how to identify, you can do this thing that black people do all the time. I didn't know that people didn't know this, but black people do this very simple thing. We count. When we go somewhere, you laughed because we count. We walk into a room and we immediately start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 black people. And the reason why is because representation is the basic level of equality, right? If we're not in the space, then we know there can't be equality in that space. And so the basic level of equality is representation. Now, I think it's important to know I said basic level, so you can't just be like, well, they're here, now that's it, because oftentimes we use that as a scapegoat. But if you're not sure, if you're whatever space you're in, take a look and begin to count and see if whatever area it is, you see representation there at the very least. That's a basic level. That's how you can start to identify. You want to be intentional? Start counting. And I'll share a story of how I did that. The next step is education. Educating yourself and educating others. How do you address these things that you've now identified? What's the best thing? Are there other people who are already doing this work? What's the background or the reason that exists? You get that education piece, and then from there, you move to policy. What is it that I can change? What is it I can help to change? What things are within my power in the existing policy to influence, or what things are in my power to change in that policy? And so that's the IEP model. And I want to share a couple of stories of when I've used this, because I've been able to use this throughout my career. No matter what I've done, no matter what position I find myself in, I use this same model. And so I want to share one early in my career, and then I want to share one maybe later in my career. So earlier in my career, I was working for an urban university, and I was doing admissions. And so they had hired me for this role, and the very first thing I did was I began to count, not necessarily just in the office, but I did count the people in the office too. But I began to count and see that the students we were admitting didn't seem to mirror the environment that our university was in. And so all of a sudden, I counted and I recognized these numbers don't match. Well, whenever you see numbers not matching, that's a place to identify, hey, there's something potentially wrong here. So after I identified, hey, students are not getting in here, they're not coming here, the next thing to do was to educate. I went out to the schools and I said, why aren't you coming? Are we not recruiting there? Are we not spending time there? Do you not like the atmosphere? Do we not offer the programs you need? What barriers are there? And what I found was that the reason that students weren't coming there, the primary reason that students weren't coming there was because of finances and cost. Not just cost to attend, but cost to apply. And so all of a sudden, after that, I began to do some unique things. I went around the office and I started saying, hey, these are obstacles that students are facing. And I was lucky to have some allies in that office who wanted to see this, and you won't always have that case, but who wanted to see that. And so we began to say, well, we can't change the admissions policy, but you know what we can do? What if we can make on-the-spot decisions at the schools? What if we can tell these kids that if you can get admitted, then we'll provide some aid for you. And then by the time I finished and was ready to leave that job, during my time there, they created a scholarship for students that if you just simply graduated from that district, from the urban school district, you got a scholarship to come to the university. But see, I started by identifying the problem. I then went and educated those around me, and I educated myself, and then I pushed to see what I could do within my power. I didn't have any. I was an entry level. So I didn't have any power. I just moved the policy to make it more accessible. And from that, the policy changed to be something else. Later in my career, I was working for a very selective professional program. And in this program, we had about 1,000 people apply every year. We had let in 100 people. And what I noticed, again, was that people were not being interviewed, not even selected. They weren't being interviewed as often as their counterparts or as often as the representation of the city around it. And so I began to say, what do we need to do here? And so in that position, I actually had power to choose who would get interviews. And so I just started interviewing more people of color. I just started bringing them in. I didn't ask anyone. I just started doing that because I didn't violate the policy. I just used my power within the policy. I identified the problem. I began to use my power within that. As a result of that, what I began to find out is when they started getting interviewed, they weren't getting selected. And I was like, why is that? And what I found is the background processes that we were using to evaluate them didn't account for the unique elements in their stories, right? If you were working 35 hours a week while, doing schoolwork, while caring for your siblings, none of that got any value in the selection process. And so we were like, man, we're missing these elements that we need within this program. And so we were able to go back and readjust the selection process to say, we're going to add what we call, I can't give you the name of it because it's a selective program. I don't want anybody to know based on my background. But we added in a way to account for those stories that maybe didn't show numerical tangency like that. And it allowed people to be able to come in. And then, but like I said, the process then just starts all over again. Because after we started admitting more people, the next thing was, what's their matriculation look like? Are they graduating at the same rate? Are they having the same experiences within? And that's when identification happens again, education happens again, policy happens again. It's a never-ending thing. You can be intentional about it at any point, and you can use this IEP model. And for me, I think people who are looking for ways to get in, identify, educate, policy. Go. And so those would be my reflections on anti-racism.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll be able to explore more afterwards in our Zoom room. So thank you so much for what you shared. And last but not least, we have, I call her Doctor. Amen. Dr. Anita Maltbia. Please share with us and what you have, the wisdom you have to share with us.
Well, thank you so very much for asking me to be here. It's an absolute pleasure. I've sat here and enjoyed hearing everybody. Stuart, you were a cute kid.
Surprise!
My God. I don't want to say what happened, but yeah. But you know what I picked up from your remarks, that you, in your innocence and your purity of relationship, pressed your parents to make a decision. That was a beautiful thing, a beautiful thing. What I love about my friend Betsy, and let me tell you, this is a dyed-in-the-wool woman. She is so serious about being anti-racist, to the extent that I told her I felt sorry for her sometimes. Because sometimes the burden gets heavy, but she hangs in there. And I love the way that she concerns herself with the nuances and with the visuals, to be in the process of helping little black children to read, but at the same time to be conscious that you don't want your children to develop a missionary mentality. You want them to feel that they are helping a peer. That's a beautiful thing, Betsy. And this is my first time meeting Dr. West. And when you talked about you're just sure that when God comes back, he is not going to eliminate ethnicity and diversity among his children, I love that, because you know I'm an Animal Channel devotee. And I've always theorized that God had so much fun making all those creatures. I mean, he had himself one party. All kinds of shapes and sizes, and the colors are fabulous. So why would he do less with us, his children? So I was supposed to say a little bit about who I am, and let me just say that the pinnacle for me is that I was the lead in the second grade production of The Little Red Hen. And I want you all to know that, okay? I still remember the song, which I won't render now because we don't have time, but that was the top. My dad made my costume and everything. So, yeah, please remember that, will you? Okay. I did manage, though, to go on and Betsy, you know, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, we forgive Stuart. He didn't know. Graduated from KU with a bachelor's in journalism. I eventually went on and got a master's in public administration. And after working in the Rockies and working on the West Coast and working on the East Coast and working in Jefferson City, I came back home and went to work for the city of Kansas City, Missouri, thinking, well, you've been gone for a while, so just, get a job and get the lay of the land, and then you'll decide what you really want to do. And I retired 26 and a half years later because it was that interesting and it was that challenging. And the work that I had done around the country with people of different ethnicities had prepared me well to deal with the public. And we were taking care of things that people couldn't do for themselves, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I headed up administration for the Public Works Department for quite a few years. I went over to convention and entertainment and got to be there when we built the suspension roof section with the artwork on top. And then I was asked to be an assistant city manager, and I completed my career with 8.5 years in the city manager's office. So I feel very blessed and pretty old right now as I sit here. And I'm thinking, I could be Pastor Cheryl's big sister. I could probably be Stuart and Betsy's mama and Wes's grandma. So I've got a few notes here, folks, that I'm going to have to look at now and then, okay? All right, then. My sisters and I have two sisters, and we were all born in the mid-40s and 50s. And a lot of times we just remark, all out of the blue, how thankful we are for our parents and who they were. And one of the things that we're thankful about is that as we were growing up, even though we grew up in that era, and so obviously they were born back in the 20s, late teens in the 20s, we never heard them make derogatory remarks about white people. They didn't saddle us with that. They had expectations for us, no matter who we were dealing with. Now, this, in spite of the fact that my mom, for instance, grew up in a little Missouri town, Odessa, and if a black child wanted to go past the 8th grade, they had to leave home because there was no provision of high school education for black children. So if you can imagine a 13, 14-year-old person having to pull up and leave home, which my mom did, and she worked for a family while she completed her high school education. My dad served in World War II, and he had a great big old wound on his leg where he had been shot. But when he was moved around as a soldier on the troop trains, they were segregated. And if they happened to be on the same car as white soldiers, they were put behind a black curtain. My dad, when I was a teenager, had a cerebral hemorrhage while he was out on his mail route. This was back in 1962. And neighbors called the ambulance. They got him in the ambulance and all, took him to the closest hospital, which was Baptist at that time. And his gurney was stopped at the door, and he was told, "We don't serve black people here." So he's bleeding in his brain, and they had to turn around and then take him all the way down to the Veterans Hospital, which where we're talking about from 60-something clear down to on Van Brunt. My parents experienced these kinds of things, but they never talked derogatorily. And we're grateful for that. But as I grew up, I experienced some things for myself. For instance, I was told that we couldn't go to Fairland Park, which was an amusement park here in Kansas City for many years, except for one day a year. And that day was set aside for minority children to be able to go to that park. One day a year. Needless to say, I did not go to Fairland Park. But my parents didn't grouse about it, they just said no. When I was in high school, I won the poetry reading contest. James Weldon Johnson's The Creation. You ought to look it up. It's magnificent, isn't it? Yeah. So I won that contest, but I wasn't given the winner's cup. There was a little brass cup I was supposed to get, but somehow it wasn't given to me. And what's really strange is probably, 20 years later, I was up at the school for something, I don't even remember what, and the teacher that was an English teacher at the time handed it to me then. Yeah. Several of us girls wanted to be cheerleaders. We got all caught up in the enthusiasm. We were pirates, Paseo pirates. So we confronted our principal in the front hall and said, we really want to try out for cheerleader. And he just kind of dropped his head to the side, looked down at the floor and said, girls, that wouldn't be a good idea. Oh, that was the end of that little dream. After the 8th grade, and Paseo at that time was a five-year school, so you had 8th grade through senior year. I was slotted into what at that time were called AA classes. I think they probably call them baccalaureate or something now. I'm not sure. But they were supposed to be the higher level academic classes. And I stayed in that class the whole 4 years that I was in high school. And come graduation year, and there were about 25, 26 of us that went through those 4 years together. Everybody had a scholarship but me. I couldn't understand that. I'd been right there with everybody the whole time. Well, the night of graduation, I was standing in line, about to march in, and the school counselor came up to me all excitedly and said he had found a scholarship for me. I later found out that my little 5'3" mother had had an emphatic conversation with him. And that was how I was able to go to KU. Yeah. So even though I didn't hear disparaging things, as I grew, by the time I was a teenager, young adult, I became aware of this thing called white anger and white fear. And at the time, I have to say, it was really curious to me, what would be the basis for white people to be angry or fearful when it came to people of color, and especially black people? White folk were the numerical majority. They owned or controlled all the material resources. They ran the government and the other oversight institutions. They owned the corporations. They headed the educational systems, and on and on. But as the years went on, I came to know that these two twins, white anger and fear, were actually well-crafted, time-honored constructs that keep both blacks and whites from freedom that they both need as human beings. So I want to talk a little bit about anti-racism and its connection to freedom for both groups of people. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs was published in 1943, and we've got it up on the screen there. And it still stands today as an accurate distillation of the crucial human needs for thriving in this life. So you'll notice that they're at the base, and by the way, these things are not sequential, but it is showing the cruciality all the way up to the higher aspiration level. Physiology, yeah. As a human being, you need air to breathe. You need water to drink. And these are physiological needs. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is that just the air to breathe, people of color and poor folks have most often had in juxtaposition to where they live those industries that contaminate the air. But this is a basic physiological need. And we have suffered dismantling of the EPA here in the last 2 or 3 years, right?
Well,
Water, you've got to have water. That's a physiological need. But witness Flint, Michigan. 5 years in, still don't have it right. And then there are Native American territories that have that same issue of no access to fresh water. Food, yeah, I'm a witness, 30 pounds over. It's a need. And yet we have what we call food deserts identified in most inner city neighborhoods. So we're saying that, okay, here's this hierarchy of needs, and the very basic bottom line for human existence are the physiological, and yet we have these gaps, these breaches, these holes. Now, the next level is the need for safety. And right next to breathing and having water to drink, human beings need to feel generally and broadly safe. Blacks in America don't have a solid, consistent reason to feel safe over the 400 years that they've been here. Right up to now. A lot of the unrest that we are seeing is all about people not feeling safe and decrying the fact that the very folk that are supposed to represent safety are not representing it too often in the case of Black people. And so, of course, one of the things that always comes up, well, what about Black on Black crime? Yes, that's definitely an issue, and it does, in varying degrees, contribute to folk not feeling safe. But what about white on white crime? What about Native American on Native American, Asian on Asian? The statistics show that there's comparatively little crossover between any of the ethnic groups in execution of crime. That is, until you get to the levels of power like redlining, unjust justice systems, corporate greed, police brutality and that kind of thing. So the fact of the matter is, yeah, there's black on black crime, but then white folks kill and victimize white folks too, just like every other ethnic group. The lack of safety is an issue that stems from the indifference from institutions that are supposed to provide for the safety of citizens, the codification of laws and covenants that blatantly exempt people of color from protection or participation. These are the things that haunt daily life. Here's a statistic, and it's something that we probably don't think about, particularly if we're white. But from 1882 to 1968, there were 4,743 documented lynchings in the United States. Now, documented is important because that means that we don't know what happened that wasn't seen or that was not admitted to. Although many times they were actually pretty festive events, and there are photographs that show that. Of that 4,743, 3,446 of them were black. And per the investigations of the NAACP, many of the over 1,200 whites that were lynched, they were lynched for helping blacks or being anti-lynching. Since 1968, there have been other hangings, but these end up being mostly ascribed to suicide. And that's often met with skepticism by family members and by the suicide statistics that show that blacks generally do not kill themselves in public areas, like hanging from a tree, nor by hanging for that matter. The recent leaving of Michael Brown's body on the ground for 4 hours in Ferguson, it served the same purpose. That public display of killing someone was used as a mind controller, a very effective one. And it still lasts today when black folk can be killed for walking, jogging, sleeping, talking, stop for broken tail lights, and so forth. And black parents today still need to give their children the talk. So there are other areas on this chart as we go up the chart. Belonging, not feeling like the other. And so when Dr. West talks about when black folk go someplace, one of the first things they do is count. Yeah. Because otherwise, if there's not enough there, you know that you are the other. Esteem. I do worry about my grandchildren constantly being barraged by negative statistics about the group of people that they belong to. Whatever is the deadliest or the worst, somehow it's always ascribed that we've got the most of that. And whatever is the best and the most, we're not in that group. Or at least that's what we're told. There's so many things that are not reported, and that's one of the things that I intend to recommend to our ARJ team is that in addition to all of these resources that we're providing for people to educate themselves about how racism happened, how it came about, what you can do about it, we need to also have folk to read some of the many books that talk about the accomplishments of black people. They are many. They are many. So, racism embedded in both the institutions and the structures, that is, the codified laws, affect all of these levels that we see on that chart, Maslow's hierarchy. And they have created a perpetual state of fear, both conscious and, it's important to say, subconscious. Because there are a lot of Black folk, especially those who have worked and earned and achieved to be middle class or higher, that will tell you, oh, I'm not afraid. But if you talk to them long enough, and if there's a gathering, a social gathering, where they're around each other long enough, the fears will begin to creep out because they are interwoven into the fabric. And they're very real. So then let's talk about white fear and anger for a minute. What impact can people of color, particularly Black folk, have on the disposition of those two very tangible emotions in the lives of whites? I'll begin with anger. And I asked my colleague one day, we were in a meeting.
I was hoping you were going to leave that out.
I know. I don't even remember what we were talking about. But I turned to Stuart and I said, well, what are white people angry about anyway? What could possibly be the foundation of that anger toward Black folk? Does it have to do with the fact that Blacks came out of slavery even after whites had killed each other in record numbers over the issue? Or is it that they worked toward self-sufficiency? I witnessed Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the education strategies that led to the establishment of public education systems, social support clubs that were developed all during Reconstruction, that they wanted to be equal citizens when they came out of slavery and during the Reconstruction period, or maybe because they opposed Jim Crowism rather than accept separate and unequal, or perhaps because they expected civil rights in conjunction with paying taxes to support wherever they happened to live. What are white folks angry about with Black people? Now, for some who are cognizant of our nation's history, it could be just the sight of us is a reminder of the disparate statistics on health and wealth and all that that entails. It's a constant reminder. But then for the many others that don't know our history in this country, it possibly could be that it goes back to what they've always heard or seen from influencers in their lives, not from personal negative experience, but from what they've heard, what they've been told, what came from the Black jokes on the playground. Yeah. What do white folks have to fear from Black people? Well, the statistics say that the average net worth of whites is 10 times the average for Blacks. So that seems like a pretty good cushion. White men still dominate in government leadership, the courts, the corporations, the educational institutions, the banks, and the mortgage companies. Blacks are 13% of the American population. I remember one time my husband and I were riding through a suburb somewhere out here in Johnson County, and we were admiring the beautiful homes and everything, and we said, you know, even if every black person in Kansas City could afford to move out here, it wouldn't be enough to fill these up. We're 13% of the population in the United States, 30% in Kansas City. So, what do whites have to fear from blacks? Well, for centuries, the assertion was that without restraint, black men would wholesale rape white women. There was a lot that, that was the basis. Now, this despite the fact that every black person was made to understand that even a lingering look or an offhanded remark would result in a swift and violent death or a long-term imprisonment. So, for rape of white women to be the most prevalent thought, well, quite frankly, you'd have to be crazy, because you knew what the consequence would be. There aren't enough black people to physically or politically take any established entity away from white America. I think I shared on one of our calls that, there's some young black men who, like males of any color, get to, using an old phrase, get to smelling themselves, feeling all that, and talking about the firepower that they've got. And I always gently remind them, I hear you. You've managed to collect 10, 12, 20 guns. Did you know that there are people that own gun factories? Think about it. So, could it be that one day all people of color will collectively harbor the desire to do to whites what they have collectively done to them? Is that what's at the basis of the fear? Because otherwise, fearing such a small population that does not dominate or control any of the basics of this country, although their labor built the foundation for them, it doesn't make sense to be fearful. Where is this coming from? So in order for both whites and blacks and other people of color, for that matter, to have real freedom, listen to Dr. West. Because intentional anti-racism is the answer. For all of us to be working to make right the things that are wrong. To tear out and cast out the philosophy of racial superiority that has been accepted as the status quo, the undeniable truth, and the norm. Here's what will happen. Black society will be freed from the abiding sense of fear concerning everything from human bodily needs to having to be exceptional in order to pursue the attainment of their individual potential. And let me just explain that last piece to my white brothers and sisters. There's been many a black child told that they need to be exceptional, they need to be achievers of the highest level, they need to go the extra mile if they want to be accepted, if they want to make it. White society will be freed from the poisonous, exhaustive work of trying to inhibit, prohibit, constrain, and restrain whole populations of people. That takes a lot of effort. That takes a lot of energy. And it's all negative. One of my favorite lines from the movie The Help is when the lead character, I forget what's the actress name that played that lead character in The Help. Anybody remember? Shame on me because I'm bad with names. But anyway, she looked at her employer and she said, don't you get tired of being nasty, of saying mean things, of doing things to exclude and set aside? Wouldn't it be great to be free of feeling like you've got to hold back a whole group of people? Actions which generate anger from the sheer weight, the breadth, and the constancy of the endeavor, and create fear that one day the script will be flipped. We can all be free. White, black, whatever color you might be. If we just practice to do away with that which seeks to be superior, to be restraining, constraining, prohibitive of other folk. That's intentional anti-racism.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for hanging in here with us. And we are going to go to our Zoom rooms. Our ending time is usually 8:15, so we won't have a lot of time in there. But I want to thank those of you who have participated, have come in 1, 2, or 3 of our sessions. We just want you to know we will be providing resources. And please stay tuned for classes coming from missions or discipleship. And I hope and pray that everyone has been motivated to the task and the journey of becoming anti-racist. Again, thank you to Anita, Stuart, Betsy, and Wes. Appreciate all who have participated in the previous weeks. May God bless you and keep you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.